The burgundy Tesla pulled up to the circular driveway like it owned the world. Behind it, a sleek Mercedes, then a gleaming BMW. Each car worth more than most people make in 2 years. I watched from the sidewalk, adjusting the collar of my polo shirt, feeling the weight of the gift bag in my hand. Mrs. Hayes had insisted I come along as her guest to the Whitman Sweet 16 party. "You work too hard, Maria," she'd said from her garden that morning. "Tyler's a good kid. You should meet some neighbors." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't mention was that those neighbors lived in houses that looked like small museums, complete with marble fountains and security gates. The Whitman estate stretched across what had to be 3 lots, its Georgian columns rising like something out of a magazine. Party guests streamed up the stone steps in designer clothes, their laughter carrying that particular sound of people who'd never worried about a mortgage payment. I slowed my pace, suddenly aware of everything about myself that didn't fit. The gift bag from Target instead of some boutique. My department store outfit that felt perfectly fine an hour ago, but now seemed to announce itself. Even my car, parked 3 blocks away because the valet line was too intimidating, felt like evidence of something I couldn't quite name. The music grew louder as I approached the entrance, some kind of jazz quartet playing under white tents. Servers in crisp uniforms moved between clusters of guests carrying silver trays. Everything sparkled under string lights that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I looked around for Mrs. Hayes but couldn't spot her gray hair in the sea of perfectly styled heads. That's when I felt the hand on my shoulder. Firm, directing, assuming. "You're late," the man said without looking at my face. He was tall, probably mid-50s, with the kind of tan that comes from golf courses and vacation homes. His white shirt was pressed to mathematical precision. "Frank's been looking for you." "The cars are backing up." I turned to face him, confused. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I'm Maria Santos. Mrs. Hayes invited me as her guest." He barely glanced at me, already scanning the driveway where more luxury cars were pulling up. Right, Maria. Look, we're behind schedule here. The Ashfords just arrived and their Bentley can't sit in the sun. You know how Mr. Ashford gets about the leather seats." The realization hit me like cold water. He thought I was hired help, one of the valet attendants. I opened my mouth to correct him, but he was already walking away, gesturing toward a clipboard by the fountain. "Frank has the rotation schedule. And remember, he's go in the lockbox, not your pocket. We had issues last time." I stood there for a moment, the gift bag suddenly feeling heavier. Around me, the party continued its elegant rhythm. Couples posed for photos by the rose garden. Teenagers gathered around what looked like a DJ setup near the pool. Parents clinked champagne glasses and discussed summer homes in the Hamptons. No one was looking at me directly, but I could feel the assumptions settling around me like dust. The smart thing would have been to find Mrs. Hayes immediately, to clear up the misunderstanding with a laugh and a handshake. But something kept my feet planted on the stone pathway. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the detective in me, always interested in seeing how situations unfold. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that wanted to know exactly how invisible I could become in a place like this. Frank Morrison turned out to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and calloused hands. He looked me up and down when I approached, taking in my polo shirt, clean jeans. "You Maria, Bradley said you'd be helping out tonight." He handed me a laminated card with car descriptions and parking spot numbers. Most of these folks are regulars. They like their cars in specific spots, same place every time. Don't take it personal if they get particular. I could have corrected him, should have corrected him. But Frank's voice carried the tired patience of someone who'd spent decades managing the whims of people with more money than manners. There was something in his eyes that made me want to help him more than I wanted to protect my own dignity. So I took the card. The silver Porsche goes in spot 12, he continued, pointing toward the back of the driveway. Owner's real specific about that one, and whatever you do, don't park the red Ferrari next to anything that might ding the paint, Mrs. Whitman still hasn't gotten over what happened at the charity gala. The first car I parked belonged to a woman who handed me her keys without making eye contact. The second owner, a man in a navy blazer, watched me like I might steal his sound system. By the third car, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt strangely familiar. It reminded me of my early days in uniform, directing traffic at accident scenes. Same careful attention to detail, same awareness that one wrong move could create a much bigger problem. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Detective Maria Santos, 10 years with the Oakwood Heights Police Department, 3 commendations for undercover work, parking cars for people who probably called the station to complain about teenagers skateboarding too loudly. I'd spent the last month working a fraud case that involved more money than most of these guests would spend on their cars. But tonight, in my Target polo and without my badge, I was just another pair of hands hired to make their evening smoother. The gift bag sat in my car, a constant reminder of why I'd come. A gaming headset for Tyler, researched carefully after Mrs. Hayes mentioned his interest in streaming, $16 from Target, wrapped in paper covered with tiny controllers. Not expensive, but thoughtful. The kind of gift that showed I'd been paying attention, that I cared enough to notice what mattered to him. But as the evening wore on, as I ferried keys back and forth and listened to casual conversations about second homes and private schools, I began to wonder if the gift would ever leave my car. Every time I thought about walking up those stone steps and announcing myself as a guest, something held me back. Maybe it was the way Bradley Whitman had looked right through me. Maybe it was the growing realization that I didn't just look like hired help to these people, I'd become hired help. The distinction felt important in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Around 8 o'clock, as the sun was setting behind the perfectly manicured hedges, I was walking back from parking a Maserati when I heard familiar laughter. Mrs. Hayes was standing near the appetizer table, her silver hair catching the string lights as she chatted with a group of women. She looked comfortable, at home in a way that made me realize how much I'd underestimated her social connections. I waved, expecting her to call me over, to introduce me to her friends, to rescue me from this strange evening I'd created for myself. She waved back with a warm smile, then turned back to her conversation. No recognition of anything unusual, no concern about where I'd been for the past 2 hours. Either she hadn't noticed I was parking cars, or she had noticed and didn't think it was worth mentioning. The feeling that settled in my chest wasn't anger exactly. It was more like the slow dawning awareness that I'd been reading the situation wrong from the beginning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mrs. Hayes had invited me as her guest, yes, but guest was apparently a flexible term in Oakwood Heights. There were guests who belonged, and guests who were useful. Tonight, I was useful. Frank appeared beside me as I stood watching the party from the edge of the driveway. You doing okay? You look like you got something on your mind. I glanced at him, this man who'd accepted me without question into his small circle of evening workers. Just thinking about visibility, I said, how people see what they expect to see. He nodded like that made perfect sense. 20 years I've been working these parties. You know what I've learned? Rich folks, they got a talent for looking right past what they don't want to notice. Makes their world simpler, I guess. Before I could respond, Frank straightened up, his attention shifting to something behind me. Evening, Chief O'Connor, didn't expect to see you here tonight. I turned around and felt my stomach drop. Chief Patricia O'Connor stood about 10 feet away, elegant in a navy dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her silver hair was styled in a way that softened her features without hiding the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She was scanning the crowd with the subtle alertness of someone who never fully went off duty, even at social gatherings. "Evening, Frank," she said, her voice carrying that particular authority that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "Mrs. Whitman asked me to check on the parking situation." Apparently there was some concern about security protocols. My mind went blank. Here was my boss, the woman I reported to every morning, standing 15 feet from where I'd been parking cars for the past 2 hours. In my civilian clothes, without my badge, playing a role that made no sense in the context of anything she knew about me. Frank glanced in my direction, and I could see the moment when he registered something in my expression. "Security's been fine, Chief. No issues with any of the vehicles. Maria here's been helping out, keeping everything organized." Chief O'Connor's gaze shifted to me, and I watched as confusion flickered across her features. She knew my face. I could see the recognition dawning slowly, like someone trying to place a song they'd heard before. Her eyes took in my clothes, the valet card still clipped to my shirt, Frank's casual assumption that I belonged with him rather than with the guests. "Maria," her voice carried a question that had nothing to do with my name. The moment stretched between us like a tightrope. I could feel Frank watching, sensing tension he couldn't identify. Around us, the party continued its elegant dance. Servers moved between guests, music played, laughter rose and fell in waves. But in our small circle by the fountain, everything had gone very still. "Detective Rodriguez." Chief O'Connor's voice was quieter now, uncertain in a way I'd never heard from her before. The title hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Frank's eyebrows shot up. I felt my face flush hot, then cold. Somewhere behind us, a champagne glass clinked against another in a toast I couldn't hear. "Detective," Frank repeated, looking between us like we were speaking a language he almost understood. Chief O'Connor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry to the guests. "Maria, what are you doing here? Are you working undercover? Is there a case I'm not aware of?" The questions came fast, each one revealing how impossible this situation was to explain. How could I tell her that I'd come as a guest, but stayed as help? That I'd spent the evening parking cars because it felt easier than claiming a place I wasn't sure I deserved? That Detective Maria Santos had somehow become invisible in her own neighborhood? I started, then stopped. The truth felt too complicated, too embarrassing, too revealing of something I didn't want to examine too closely. Mrs. Hayes invited me as her guest. There was a misunderstanding about the parking situation. Chief O'Connor's eyes moved to the valet card on my shirt, then back to my face. I could see her police training kicking in, reading the situation in layers I probably hadn't even recognized myself. "A misunderstanding," she repeated slowly. Frank cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if there's been some kind of mix-up, I can sort it out with Mr. Whitman. Maria's been doing great work tonight, but if she's supposed to be somewhere else, she's supposed to be enjoying the party," Chief O'Connor said firmly. Her tone had shifted into something I recognized from the station, the voice she used when delegating assignments or correcting mistakes. "Detective Santos is one of our finest officers. She certainly shouldn't be working as unpaid help at a social gathering." The words detective and officer seemed to echo louder than they should have. I glanced toward the party, wondering if anyone else had heard, if Bradley Whitman was somewhere within earshot getting the education of his lifetime. Frank was staring at me with new eyes, the kind of look that suggested he was recalculating everything about the past 2 hours. "You're a police detective, a real detective." Before I could answer, Chief O'Connor was extending her hand toward the party. "Detective Santos, I believe you and I have some people to meet, starting with our hosts." The invitation was polite, but it wasn't really a suggestion. Chief O'Connor had that way about her, the ability to frame orders as requests without losing any of their authority. I unclipped the valet card from my shirt and handed it back to Frank, who took it like it might bite him. "Frank," Chief O'Connor said, "it's been a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for looking out for Detective Santos this evening." As we walked toward the stone steps, I could feel the evening shifting around us. The party looked the same from the outside, the same elegant guests and refined atmosphere, but now I was walking through it with my boss, who knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. The invisibility I'd wrapped around myself for the past 2 hours was dissolving with each step. "Maria," Chief O'Connor said quietly as we climbed the steps, "remind me on Monday to discuss community relations protocols. I think we might need to review how our officers engage with neighborhood events." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if the problem was protocol or something much more personal, something about the space between who I was and who people assumed I could be. The gift bag was still in my car, 3 blocks away. Tyler was probably somewhere inside, celebrating his 16th birthday, surrounded by friends and family, and all the markers of a life that had never questioned its own worth. And I was about to walk into that celebration not as invisible help, but as Detective Maria Santos. The evening was far from over. Walking up those stone steps beside Chief O'Connor, I felt the weight of every choice I'd made that evening pressing down on me. Each step brought me closer to a conversation I wasn't prepared to have, with people who had spent the past 2 hours treating me like furniture. The gift bag in my distant car seemed to mock me now, a reminder of the genuine gesture that had been overshadowed by my own willingness to disappear. The party opened up before us, like a scene from a movie I'd never been cast in. Crystal glasses caught the light from overhead chandeliers that had been moved outside for the occasion. Women in silk dresses moved gracefully between conversations, their jewelry catching starlight. Men in tailored jackets discussed business deals and golf handicaps, with the easy confidence of people who had never doubted their place in any room they entered. Chief O'Connor moved through the crowd with natural authority, nodding to acquaintances and scanning faces with the practiced eye of someone who commanded respect wherever she went. I found myself studying her, wondering how she navigated these social waters so effortlessly. She belonged here in a way that seemed both natural and earned, carrying herself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was, regardless of the setting. We paused near the appetizer station, where servers offered delicate canapés on silver trays. The food looked like art, each piece carefully constructed and probably costing more per bite than most people spent on lunch. I watched guests select items with the casual indifference of people who had never questioned whether they deserved the finest things available. "Tell me about Tyler," Chief O'Connor said, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "How do you know the family?" The question seemed simple, but I could hear the detective in her voice, gathering information and building context. "I don't really, Mrs. Hayes from my apartment complex invited me. She's friendly with the Whitman somehow, said Tyler was a good kid, and I should meet some neighbors." Chief O'Connor nodded slowly, her eyes taking in the elaborate decorations and obvious expense surrounding us. "And when did the parking situation begin?" The way she phrased it made it sound like an incident report, which in some ways I suppose it was. "Bradley Whitman approached me when I arrived, assumed I was part of the valet crew. I should have corrected him immediately. But you didn't." There was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. "No, I didn't. I watched a teenager who had to be Tyler holding court near the pool, surrounded by friends who hung on his every word. He looked confident and happy, completely at ease in his designer clothes and expensive surroundings. I guess I wanted to see what would happen, how invisible someone like me could become in a place like this." Chief O'Connor followed my gaze toward Tyler, then back to the adults mingling around us. "And what did you discover?" Before I could answer, I spotted Mrs. Hayes approaching through the crowd. Her face lit up when she saw me, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of hope that she would provide some kind of bridge between the evening I'd planned and the one I'd actually experienced. "Maria, there you are, dear. I was wondering where you'd gotten to." She reached out to squeeze my arm, her touch warm and genuine. "I hope you've been enjoying yourself. Isn't this just spectacular? The Whitmans certainly know how to throw a celebration." I felt Chief O'Connor's attention sharpen beside me, waiting to see how I would handle the introduction. Mrs. Hayes turned toward her, with the kind of bright smile reserved for meeting new people at social gatherings. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Eleanor Hayes, Maria's neighbor. Are you a friend of the Whitmans?" Chief O'Connor extended her hand with practiced grace. "Patricia O'Connor. I work with Maria at the police department." The word work hung in the air with deliberate ambiguity, but Mrs. Hayes's eyes widened with interest. "Oh, how wonderful. Are you in administration? I always think police work must be so challenging for women, especially in leadership roles." "I'm the chief," Patricia said simply, her tone carrying no arrogance, just fact. Mrs. Hayes blinked, then looked between us with dawning realization. "Chief, as in chief of police. And Maria, you work for the police department." I could see the moment when she began reassembling everything she thought she knew about me. The quiet neighbor who worked odd hours and kept to herself. The woman who helped carry groceries and never complained about noise. Suddenly, I wasn't just Maria from apartment 4B. "Maria is one of our detective sergeants," Chief O'Connor said, and I felt grateful for the title that placed me firmly in professional territory. "She specializes in undercover work and financial crimes." "Detective," Mrs. Hayes repeated, her voice rising slightly, "but you never said." "I mean, I had no idea. I just thought you worked for the city somehow." The conversation was drawing attention from nearby guests, curious faces turning toward our small group. I could feel the social mathematics shifting around us, people recalculating my presence based on new information. Detective, police, not what they expected from someone who'd been parking their cars. "Mrs. Hayes," I said carefully, "when you invited me tonight, did you mention to the Whitmans that I'd be coming as your guest?" Her expression shifted, becoming slightly uncertain. "Well, I spoke to Jennifer about bringing someone. She said it would be fine, that there was always room for one more at these gatherings. But I may not have been entirely clear about who you were." Chief O'Connor and I exchanged glances. The picture was becoming clearer now, the series of assumptions and miscommunications that had led to my evening as unpaid help. Mrs. Hayes had been vague, Jennifer Whitman had been casual in her agreement, and Bradley had filled in the gaps with his own expectations. "Where did you think Maria was this evening?" Chief O'Connor asked, her tone carefully neutral. Mrs. Hayes looked confused, glancing between us. "I assumed she was mingling, meeting people. Isn't that what one does at parties?" She paused, studying my face more carefully. "Were you not enjoying yourself? You seem troubled." Before I could formulate an answer, a new voice cut through our conversation like a blade through silk. "Eleanor, there you are. I was hoping to introduce you to the Ashfords." Jennifer Whitman approached with the kind of smile that managed to be both welcoming and exclusive at the same time. She was perfectly put together in a way that suggested hours of preparation, her blonde hair styled to look effortlessly elegant, her makeup applied by someone who understood the subtle art of looking naturally flawless. Her eyes moved over our small group, pausing when they reached Chief O'Connor, clearly recognizing someone of importance, even if she couldn't immediately place her. Then her gaze settled on me, and I watched as confusion flickered across her features. "I don't believe we've met," she said to me, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Jennifer Whitman, Tyler's mother." The moment stretched between us, loaded with irony. Here was the woman whose husband had directed me to park cars for the past 2 hours, now introducing herself as if I were a stranger at her own party. I could feel Chief O'Connor's attention like a spotlight, Mrs. Hayes's growing bewilderment, and the weight of dozens of conversations happening around us. Maria Santos, I said, taking her hand. Mrs. Hayes's guest. Jennifer's smile remained perfectly in place, but I saw something shift behind her eyes. A flicker of uncertainty, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Of course, Maria, Eleanor mentioned she might bring someone. I hope you're enjoying the celebration. It's been educational, I replied, and felt Chief O'Connor's slight intake of breath beside me. Mrs. Hayes cleared her throat delicately. Jennifer, I was just learning that Maria is a detective with the police department. Isn't that fascinating? And this is Chief O'Connor, her supervisor. The information hit Jennifer like a splash of cold water. I watched her face cycle through surprise, confusion, and what might have been embarrassment before settling back into polished composure, but the damage was done. The careful social architecture of the evening had shifted, and everyone in our small circle could feel it. A detective, Jennifer repeated slowly. How interesting. I had no idea we had such distinguished guests this evening. The word distinguished carried weight, a recognition that something significant had been overlooked. Chief O'Connor stepped forward slightly, her presence suddenly more commanding. Detective Santos has been with our department for 10 years, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to command attention. She's received multiple commendations for her work on complex financial fraud cases. Just last month, she helped recover over $2 million in stolen assets. The numbers seemed to echo in the space between us. $2 million. More money than many of the guests at this party would see in their lifetimes, despite their obvious wealth. It placed me in a different category entirely, someone who moved in circles that intersected with theirs, but operated by completely different rules. Jennifer's smile became strained. How remarkable, and here I was thinking, she trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought that everyone present could fill in for themselves. Thinking what? Chief O'Connor's question was polite but pointed. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Around us, the party continued its elegant rhythm, but our small group had become an island of tension in the sea of celebration. I could see other guests beginning to notice. Conversations pausing as people sensed drama unfolding. Mrs. Hayes broke the silence with nervous laughter. Well, this is all very exciting. Maria, you really should have told me about your career. I feel quite foolish for not knowing. There was no reason you should have known, I said gently. I prefer to keep my work and personal life separate when possible. Of course, Jennifer said quickly, seizing on the explanation. Privacy is so important, especially in law enforcement. I completely understand why you might not advertise your profession, but Chief O'Connor wasn't letting her off that easily. Still, it's interesting that Detective Santos spent the evening working with your valet staff, rather than enjoying the party as Mrs. Hayes's invited guest. The statement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication through the group. Jennifer's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Mrs. Hayes looked confused, glancing between us as she tried to understand what she'd missed. Working with the valet staff, Mrs. Hayes repeated. Maria, what does she mean? I felt the weight of the moment settling around us. This was the choice point, the place where I could either smooth over the evening's misunderstandings with polite deflection, or acknowledge what had actually happened. Chief O'Connor's presence beside me felt like both support and expectation. When I arrived tonight, I said carefully, your husband assumed I was part of the hired help. He directed me to work with Frank, parking cars for your guests. Mrs. Hayes's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my goodness, Bradley did what? Jennifer's composure finally cracked. There must have been some misunderstanding. Bradley would never, that is, he wouldn't intentionally. Wouldn't intentionally. What? Chief O'Connor's voice was quiet, but it cut through Jennifer's fumbling explanation like a scalpel. The question hung in the air, demanding an honest answer that no one seemed prepared to give, because the truth was clear to everyone present.
Bradley Whitman had looked at me in my target clothes, and without obvious markers of wealth or status, and assumed I belonged with the help, rather than with the guests. It was an assumption so automatic, so unthinking, that he hadn't even considered alternatives. Jennifer looked around desperately, as if hoping to find her husband in the crowd to explain himself, but Bradley was nowhere to be seen, probably inside the house, or by the pool, blissfully unaware that his casual prejudice was being dissected by his wife, a police chief, and the woman he'd spent the evening treating as hired help. "I should find Bradley," Jennifer said weakly. "I'm sure he'll want to apologize personally for the confusion." "I'm sure he will," Chief O'Connor agreed, her tone suggesting that she would be very interested in hearing that apology. As Jennifer hurried away to find her husband, Mrs. Hayes turned to me with stricken eyes. "Maria, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. If I had known what was happening, I would have intervened immediately." "I know you would have," I said, and meant it. Mrs. Hayes was a kind woman who had genuinely thought she was doing me a favor by including me in her social circle. She couldn't have anticipated the assumptions that would follow. Chief O'Connor placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Why don't we take a walk through the party? I think it's time."
People met Detective Santos properly. As we moved deeper into the celebration, I felt the evening reshaping itself around me. The invisibility I'd worn like armor for the past 2 hours was dissolving, replaced by something more complex and potentially more powerful. I was no longer the quiet woman parking cars in the shadows. I was Detective Maria Santos, and Chief O'Connor was making sure everyone knew it. The gift bag still sat in my car 3 blocks away, but for the first time that evening I began to think Tyler might actually receive it after all. The realization hit me like stepping into sunlight after hours in a dark room. Standing there beside Chief O'Connor, watching Jennifer Whitman's carefully constructed social facade crumble in real time, I finally understood the complete picture of my evening. This hadn't been a series of innocent misunderstandings or unfortunate coincidences. This had been a systematic reduction of my humanity to a single convenient assumption. The crowd around us continued their elegant dance of conversation and laughter, but now I could see it differently. Every interaction I'd witnessed while parking cars, every casual dismissal I'd absorbed, every moment I'd felt invisible, suddenly made perfect sense. These people lived in a world where someone who looked like me, dressed like me, arriving without obvious wealth or status markers, could only serve one purpose in their universe. Chief O'Connor guided me toward a quieter section of the party, near the rose garden where the music was softer and conversations more intimate. Her presence beside me felt like a shield, but also like a spotlight. People noticed her immediately, the way they always noticed authority, and by extension they were forced to notice me as well. "Maria," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something. What happened here tonight wasn't about you not belonging. It was about their inability to see beyond their own assumptions." Her words carried the weight of experience, the voice of someone who had probably navigated similar situations throughout her career. I wondered how many times Chief O'Connor had walked into rooms where people underestimated her, how many assumptions she'd had to shatter on her way to the top of the department. "The thing is," I said, watching a server weave between guests with practiced invisibility, "part of me wonders if they were right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe the assumptions were accurate." Chief O'Connor stopped walking and turned to face me directly. Her eyes held that particular intensity she brought to difficult conversations, the look that suggested she was about to say something important and expected me to really hear it. "Detective Santos, in the past year alone you've successfully infiltrated 3 major fraud operations. You've posed as everyone from a high-end art dealer to a construction worker to a socialite at charity galas. You've adapted your appearance, your speech, your entire presence to blend into worlds most people couldn't even imagine accessing. So tell me what's different about tonight." The question cut straight to the heart of something I hadn't wanted to examine too closely. In my professional life, I was a chameleon, capable of becoming whatever the situation required. I'd sat in boardrooms with millionaire executives and in dive bars with career criminals, equally comfortable in both settings because I was there with purpose, with authority, with a badge that gave me permission to occupy any space necessary for the job. But tonight I'd walked into this world as myself. Not Detective Santos on assignment, not Maria the undercover operative with a carefully constructed identity, just Maria from apartment 4B, who worked long hours and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. And that version of myself had been found wanting by people who didn't even know her. Tonight was personal, I admitted. Tonight I couldn't hide behind a case file or an undercover identity. I was just me, and me wasn't enough. Chief O'Connor nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she already suspected, and that's exactly why what happened matters. These people didn't reject Detective Santos, the accomplished professional. They rejected Maria Santos, the human being, based on nothing more than their own limited imagination. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. Voices were rising above the gentle party chatter, and I could see guests turning toward the disturbance with the kind of curiosity that suggested drama was unfolding. Bradley Whitman's voice carried across the garden, tight with frustration and something that might have been embarrassment. "This is ridiculous, Jennifer. I'm not apologizing for a simple misunderstanding. The woman was dressed like staff. How was I supposed to know?" Jennifer's response was lower, urgent in the way that suggested she was trying to prevent a scene, rather than resolve a conflict. "Bradley, please. Just come speak with them. Chief O'Connor is waiting. Chief O'Connor can wait. I'm not going to be lectured at my own son's birthday party by someone who can't be bothered to dress appropriately for a social gathering." The words hit me like physical blows. Not because they were unexpected, but because they revealed the true depth of Bradley Whitman's contempt. In his mind, I hadn't just failed to look wealthy enough for his party, I had failed to perform wealth in a way that made him comfortable, and my failure to meet his unstated dress code somehow justified every assumption that followed. Chief O'Connor's jaw tightened beside me. "Stay here," she said, but there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't really giving me a choice. This was her stepping into command mode, the voice that had earned her respect throughout the department and beyond. I watched her walk toward the entrance, her posture radiating the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Guests moved aside without thinking, creating a clear path through the crowd. Even from a distance, I could see Bradley's expression change as she approached, the casual arrogance shifting to something more cautious. The rose garden suddenly felt too quiet, too isolated from the action unfolding near the house. I found myself moving closer, drawn by a combination of curiosity and the professional instinct that made me want to observe how confrontations developed and resolved. Years of police work had taught me to read situations from multiple angles, and this one was becoming more complex by the minute. Chief O'Connor reached the small group clustered around Bradley and Jennifer, and I could see the moment when her presence shifted the entire dynamic. She didn't raise her voice or make threats. She simply stood there, representing everything Bradley Whitman couldn't dismiss or diminish, and waited for him to acknowledge her. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "I believe you've met Detective Santos, though perhaps not under the best circumstances." Bradley's face flushed red above his perfectly pressed collar. "Look, if there was some confusion earlier, I'm happy to clear it up, but I'm not going to be made to feel guilty for assuming someone was part of the staff when they were dressed like staff." The defense was weak and everyone present knew it. Jennifer closed her eyes briefly, as if hoping the entire situation might disappear through force of will. Several guests had gathered at the edges of the confrontation, drawn by the unusual sight of their host being challenged at his own party. Dressed like staff, Chief O'Connor repeated thoughtfully. And how exactly does staff dress, Mr. Whitman? It was a question designed to expose the assumptions underlying his behavior, and Bradley seemed to realize he was walking into dangerous territory. I just meant, casual clothes. Not formal wear. I see, so anyone not wearing formal attire to your party should expect to be put to work. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Then perhaps you can explain what you did mean. Because from where I stand, it appears you saw Detective Santos, made a series of assumptions based on her appearance, and assigned her work without her consent or compensation. The words hung in the evening air like an indictment. Around us, the party had gone noticeably quieter, conversations pausing as people strained to hear this unprecedented challenge to their host's authority in his own domain. Bradley looked around desperately, seeking support from guests who were suddenly finding their champagne glasses fascinating. This is absurd. I'm not going to be interrogated at my son's birthday party. No one's interrogating you, Chief O'Connor said calmly. I'm simply trying to understand how a decorated police detective ended up parking cars at a social gathering she was invited to attend as a guest. The phrase decorated police detective seemed to echo louder than it should have. I could see it registering with the gathered guests, forcing them to recalculate everything they thought they understood about the evening's events. The quiet woman who had been moving their cars with professional efficiency was suddenly someone entirely different, someone whose presence at this party represented authority and capability they hadn't bothered to recognize. Jennifer stepped forward, clearly hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of her husband's social blunder. Chief O'Connor, I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding. Perhaps we could speak privately. There's nothing private about assuming someone's place in the world based on their appearance, Chief O'Connor replied. That's a public issue, especially when it involves one of my officers. The word officers carried implications that made several guests shift uncomfortably. They were no longer witnessing a social awkwardness between strangers. They were watching the police chief defend one of her own against treatment that was beginning to look increasingly indefensible. Bradley seemed to realize that his usual tactics weren't working in this situation. He couldn't dismiss Chief O'Connor the way he might dismiss other challenges to his authority. She represented power that operated outside his social sphere, power that didn't depend on wealth or connections or carefully maintained appearances. Look, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier belligerence, if Detective Santos felt disrespected, that wasn't my intention. It was just a misunderstanding that lasted 2 hours, Chief O'Connor observed. 2 hours during which Detective Santos performed unpaid labor while your invited guests enjoyed your hospitality. The mathematical precision of her statement made the situation even more damning. 2 hours, a significant portion of the evening, time that should have been spent celebrating with Tyler and meeting neighbors, instead spent in service to people who couldn't be bothered to see her as anything more than convenient help. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Part of me wanted to step forward and diffuse the situation, to play peacemaker and smooth over the rough edges of the evening, with the kind of gracious forgiveness that would let everyone save face. It would be easier that way, more comfortable for everyone involved. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger throughout the evening, wanted to see this through to its natural conclusion. I wanted Bradley Whitman to fully understand what he had done, not just to me personally, but to the idea that people deserve to be seen and valued, regardless of how well they performed, wealth or status. Chief O'Connor must have sensed my presence behind her, because she glanced back and made eye contact. In that look I saw a question. This could end here with social discomfort and awkward apologies, or it could continue, with all the messiness and revelation that might follow. The choice, her expression suggested, was mine to make.
The gift bag was still in my car. 3 blocks away, Tyler was still somewhere in this crowd, celebrating his 16th birthday surrounded by luxury and love, and the assumption that the world would always welcome him with open arms. Mrs. Hayes was still watching this unfold with growing horror, probably wishing she had never invited me into this particular corner of her social world. But I was no longer the woman who had walked up these stone steps 2 hours ago, clutching a carefully chosen present and hoping to blend quietly into someone else's celebration. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of myself and my place in the world. The question now was whether I was brave enough to honor that shift, even if it meant making everyone uncomfortable. Chief O'Connor was still waiting, still holding space for whatever I decided to do next. The party swirled around us, suspended between politeness and honesty, between maintaining appearances and acknowledging truth. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt the particular kind of clarity that came with knowing exactly who I was, and exactly what I deserved. The moment I stepped forward, the entire dynamic of the confrontation shifted. Every conversation around us seemed to pause, as if the party itself was holding its breath. Chief O'Connor moved slightly to the side, creating space for me while maintaining her protective presence. Bradley Whitman's eyes widened as he finally got a clear look at my face, perhaps recognizing for the first time that I was an actual person rather than a convenient assumption. "Mr. Whitman," I said, my voice carrying the steady authority I'd developed through years of interrogating suspects and testifying in court. "I believe we need to have a conversation." The directness of my approach seemed to catch him off guard. He'd probably expected me to remain in the background while others discussed my situation, the way hired help might be expected to stay invisible even when being defended. Instead, here I was, claiming space in his social circle and demanding his attention as an equal. "Detective Santos," he began, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The title sat awkwardly in his mouth, as if he was still struggling to reconcile the woman who had been parking his guests' cars with the professional standing before him now. "For the past 2 hours, I've been observing your party from a unique perspective," I continued, letting my words settle into the space between us. "I've seen how your guests interact with people they perceive as service workers. I've listened to their conversations about money and status, and the assumption that their comfort comes before other people's dignity." The gathered crowd was growing larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of their host being challenged so directly. I could see familiar faces from earlier in the evening, guests whose cars I had carefully parked, whose keys I had respectfully handled, who had looked through me as if I were invisible. I've also seen how quickly respect can appear when someone's true identity is revealed, I added, glancing toward the guests who were now studying me with newfound interest. "The question I have is whether that respect was always deserved, or whether it only matters now because you know I carry a badge." Bradley's face cycled through several shades of red. "Now see here, I don't appreciate being lectured by someone who deceived us about her identity." "Deceived you?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended. "Mr. Whitman, at what point this evening did you ask who I was? When did you inquire about my background or profession before assigning me to work?" The silence that followed was answer enough. He hadn't asked because he hadn't cared. My identity had been irrelevant to him until it became inconvenient to his worldview. Chief O'Connor stepped closer, her voice cutting through the tension with professional precision. "Mr. Whitman, I think what Detective Santos is illustrating is the difference between assuming someone's worth and actually seeing them as a complete person." Jennifer appeared beside her husband, her earlier composure completely abandoned. "Please, this is getting out of hand. It's Tyler's birthday. Can't we just move past this?" "Where is Tyler?" I asked, suddenly realizing that the guest of honor had been absent from this entire confrontation. Shouldn't he be part of this conversation, considering this party is supposed to be celebrating him? The question seemed to surprise everyone, including myself, but as soon as I'd asked it, I realized it was the most important question of the evening. A 16-year-old boy was learning something tonight about how the world worked, about who mattered and who didn't, about the casual cruelty that wealth and privilege could enable. Tyler's inside with his friends. Jennifer said weakly, "He doesn't need to be involved in this adult conversation." Actually, I said, "I think he does. Because what happened here tonight isn't just about me, it's about what kind of man Tyler is going to become, and what lessons he's learning about how to treat people." Chief O'Connor nodded approvingly. "Detective Santos raises an excellent point. This is very much an educational moment." Bradley looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route from a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to be made the villain at my own son's party because of a simple misunderstanding." "Then don't be the villain," I said simply. "Acknowledge what happened, own the assumptions you made. Show Tyler what it looks like when someone takes responsibility for their mistakes." The challenge hung in the air between us, witnessed by dozens of his social peers and colleagues. I could see him calculating the cost of admission against the cost of continued denial, weighing his pride against his reputation. Before he could respond, a young voice cut through the tension from behind us. "Mom, Dad, what's going on out here?" Tyler Whitman emerged from the house, his designer shirt slightly wrinkled from whatever activities had been occupying him and his friends. He looked between his parents and the gathered crowd with the kind of confusion that suggested he'd walked into the middle of a story he couldn't quite understand. He was tall for his age, with his father's strong jawline and his mother's intelligent eyes, but there was something softer in his expression, something that suggested he hadn't yet hardened into the casual arrogance I'd observed in so many of the adult guests. "Tyler," Jennifer said quickly, "everything's fine, just some adult conversation. Why don't you go back inside?" But Tyler was already looking at me with curiosity rather than dismissal. "Are you the police detective everyone's talking about? The one who was parking cars earlier?" The directness of his question caught me off guard. Unlike his father, Tyler seemed genuinely interested in understanding the situation rather than managing it. "Yes," I said. "I'm Detective Santos." "Cool. I've never met a real detective before." He studied my face with the kind of open curiosity that most adults had lost somewhere along the way. "Why were you parking cars if you're a police detective?" The question was so innocent, so free of the social calculations that had shaped every other interaction I'd had that evening, that I found myself smiling for the first time in hours. "Good question, Tyler. Your father assumed I was part of the valet crew when I arrived as Mrs. Hayes's guest. Instead of correcting him, I decided to see what it would be like to be invisible at your party." Tyler's forehead wrinkled as he processed this information. "But why would Dad assume you were working here? You're somebody's guest." The question cut straight to the heart of everything his parents had been trying to avoid acknowledging, out of the mouths of babes. As they said, Tyler's 16-year-old logic was clearer than any of the adult rationalizations I'd heard. Bradley stepped forward, clearly hoping to control the narrative before it got away from him entirely. "Son, sometimes adults make mistakes based on incomplete information, but you didn't ask for more information," Tyler pointed out with the relentless logic of adolescence. "If you thought she worked here, wouldn't you have asked Frank who she was?" Chief O'Connor made a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Tyler was dismantling his father's defense with the kind of straightforward questioning that prosecutors dreamed of. "Tyler's right," I said, looking directly at Bradley. "You didn't ask Frank. You didn't ask me. You saw what you expected to see and acted accordingly." The teenager looked between his parents and me with growing understanding. "So you actually worked parking cars for my party even though you were invited as a guest? That's kind of messed up." "Tyler," Jennifer's voice carried sharp warning. "No, Mom, it is messed up. Think about it from her perspective. She came to celebrate my birthday and ended up working for free because Dad made assumptions. He turned to me with something that looked like genuine regret. I'm really sorry that happened. That's not how guests should be treated at our house. The apology, coming from the person the evening was supposed to honor, carried more weight than anything his father might say.
Oh.
Tyler hadn't been responsible for the assumptions or the casual dismissal, but he was taking responsibility for the impact on someone who had come to celebrate with him. "Thank you, Tyler," I said. "That means a lot. Did you bring me a gift?" He asked with the kind of direct curiosity that made me laugh despite everything. "I did actually. It's in my car, which I parked 3 blocks away because the valet line was intimidating." Tyler grinned. "Want to go get it? I'd like to meet you properly, as a guest at my party instead of someone my dad accidentally put to work." The offer was so genuine, so free of the social complications that had defined the rest of the evening, that I felt something tight in my chest finally loosen. "I'd like that very much." As we walked toward the street together, Tyler chattering easily about school and friends, and his plans for his newly acquired driving privileges, I could hear the party resuming behind us. Conversations picked up, the string quartet began another song, and the elegant dance of wealth and privilege continued its familiar patterns. But something fundamental had shifted. Chief O'Connor fell into step beside us, her presence a reminder that the evening's revelations wouldn't simply disappear with polite social amnesia. Bradley and Jennifer would have to reckon with what had been exposed, not just about their assumptions but about the casual cruelty those assumptions enabled. "Detective Santos," Tyler said as we reached the street, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Shoot. Do you think my parents are bad people, because of what happened tonight?" The question was asked with the kind of earnest concern that only teenagers could manage, desperate to understand how the adults in their world measured up against their developing sense of right and wrong. I considered my answer carefully. "I think your parents are people who live in a very specific world, with very specific rules. Sometimes those rules make it hard to see beyond immediate assumptions. That doesn't make them bad people, but it does mean they have some learning to do." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "And I guess I do too. I mean, I didn't notice what was happening either. I was just hanging out with my friends while you were working. You were celebrating your birthday, exactly like you should have been. The failure wasn't yours." We reached my car, and I unlocked the trunk to retrieve the gift bag I'd carefully prepared hours earlier. The gaming headset seemed both exactly right and completely inadequate after everything that had transpired. Tyler opened the bag with genuine excitement, examining the headset with the kind of appreciation that suggested he understood the thought that had gone into the choice. "This is perfect. I've been wanting to upgrade my setup for streaming. How did you know? Mrs. Hayes mentioned you were interested in gaming. I did some research." "You researched gaming headsets for someone you'd never met. That's what you do when you care about giving a good gift." Tyler looked up from the headset with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what's weird? You put more thought into my birthday present than most of the people who've known me my whole life." The observation stung because it was probably true. I'd spent weeks researching and saving for this gift, while guests inside were probably giving expensive items chosen by personal assistants, or grabbed from high-end stores without a second thought. Chief O'Connor, who had been quietly observing our interaction, stepped forward. "Tyler, can I tell you something about Detective Santos that you might find interesting?" He nodded eagerly. "She specializes in financial fraud cases. Last month, she helped recover money that had been stolen from elderly victims who'd been targeted by scammers. She spent 6 months undercover, pretending to be someone she wasn't, to catch criminals who were preying on vulnerable people." Tyler's eyes widened. "Like going undercover, like in the movies." "Better than the movies," Chief O'Connor said, "because it was real, and it mattered. Detective Santos has a gift for seeing people clearly, for understanding how they think, and what motivates them. That's what made her so effective at catching criminals who thought they were too smart to be caught. I felt embarrassed by the praise, but also grateful that Chief O'Connor was helping Tyler understand that there were different kinds of value in the world, different ways of measuring worth beyond wealth and social status. That's so cool, Tyler said. I bet you have amazing stories. Some I can share, some I can't. But yes, it's been an interesting career. As we walked back toward the party, Tyler carrying his gift and chattering about his interest in criminal justice shows, I realized that the evening had transformed into something I hadn't expected. Not just a confrontation with prejudice and assumption, but a genuine connection with a young person who was still forming his understanding of how the world worked. The party was winding down when we returned, guests beginning to make their polite departures. Bradley and Jennifer were nowhere to be seen, probably inside the house dealing with the social aftermath of the evening's revelations. But Mrs. Hayes appeared immediately, her face creased with concern. "Maria, dear, I am so sorry about everything. I had no idea what was happening. If I had known, I would have intervened immediately. I know you would have, Mrs. Hayes. You're a good friend. I feel terrible about bringing you into this situation. I thought it would be a nice way for you to meet some neighbors, maybe make some connections in the community." Tyler looked between us with growing understanding. "Wait, you two are neighbors? Like you live in the same building? Apartment complex?" I corrected. "Mrs. Hayes has been very kind to me since I moved in. You invited her to my party because you thought she should meet people." Mrs. Hayes nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought it would be good for both of you. Tyler's such a lovely boy, and Maria works so hard. I thought you'd enjoy each other's company." Tyler grinned. "Well, we did. Eventually. Even though it took a while to get past my parents being weird about it." The casual way he dismissed his parents' behavior as weird, rather than malicious, suggested a level of emotional maturity that
Gave me hope for his future. He was young enough to see the situation clearly, without the social conditioning that had shaped his parents' automatic responses. Chief O'Connor checked her watch. "Tyler, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I hope you'll remember tonight as more than just an awkward social situation. I hope you'll remember it as a lesson in the importance of seeing people clearly." "I will," he promised solemnly. "And Detective Santos, I hope we can hang out again sometime. Maybe you could tell me more about police work. I'm thinking about studying criminal justice in college." The offer was made with such genuine enthusiasm that I found myself agreeing before I'd fully considered the implications. Here was this kid, growing up in massive privilege, expressing interest in a career dedicated to justice and public service. Maybe there was hope for the next generation after all. As we prepared to leave, Tyler suddenly grabbed my arm. "Wait, I almost forgot. I wanted to give you something too." He disappeared into the house and returned a few minutes later with a small wrapped box. "I know it's weird for the birthday person to give gifts, but I wanted you to have this." Inside the box was a simple silver bracelet with a single charm, a small shield engraved with the word truth. "I bought it at a store downtown last week, before I knew anything about you being a detective. I just thought it was cool. But now it seems perfect." The gift was so unexpected, so thoughtful despite its simplicity that I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Tyler, this is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for teaching me something important tonight, about not making assumptions about people, about treating everyone with respect, regardless of how they look, or what you think you know about them." As Chief O'Connor and I walked toward our cars, leaving Tyler to rejoin his friends and Mrs. Hayes to make her own farewells, I felt a profound sense of completion. The evening that had begun with such hurt and confusion had somehow transformed into something redemptive. "How do you feel about what happened tonight?" Chief O'Connor asked as we reached the street. I considered the question carefully. The hurt was still there, the sting of being dismissed and invisibilized by people who should have known better. but it was tempered now by Tyler's apology, by the connections I'd made, by the knowledge that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered. Grateful, I said finally. Grateful that it happened, strange as that sounds, because it showed me something about myself I didn't know I needed to see. Which is, that I'm worthy of respect, regardless of whether people choose to give it. That my value doesn't depend on other people's ability to recognize it. Chief O'Connor smiled. That's a lesson a lot of people never learn. You're lucky you learned it at 35 instead of 65. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights, the silver bracelet catching streetlight on my wrist, I thought about the story I would tell when people asked about my evening. Not the version that would spare everyone's feelings or smooth over the uncomfortable truths that had been exposed. The real version, the one that acknowledged both the hurt and the healing, the assumptions and the revelations. The gift bag no longer sat untouched in my passenger seat. Tyler had his headset, chosen with care and given with genuine affection. I had his bracelet, a reminder that respect and recognition could come from unexpected places. And somewhere in the complex social mathematics of Oakwood Heights, a 16-year-old boy was learning that the world was more complicated and more interesting than he'd previously understood. By the time I reached my apartment, I realized that Mrs. Hayes had been right about one thing. The evening had been a valuable way to meet neighbors and make connections in the community, just not in the way any of us had expected. Sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as the worst experiences. Sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones you least expect. And sometimes standing up for yourself means letting other people witness their own assumptions crumble in real time, even when it makes everyone uncomfortable. The evening had started with me feeling invisible, and ended with me understanding that visibility was something I could claim, rather than something I had to wait for others to grant. That was a gift worth more than any expensive present, and one I would carry with me long after Tyler had outgrown his gaming headset. 6 months later, I was standing in the lobby of the Oakwood Heights Community Center, adjusting my uniform and checking my watch. The monthly community policing meeting was scheduled to start in 10 minutes, and I could already see familiar faces filtering through the glass doors. These meetings had become one of my favorite parts of the job, a chance to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods we served. The program had been Chief O'Connor's idea, launched shortly after what she diplomatically referred to as the Whitman incident in department meetings. She'd recognized that the evening had revealed something important about the invisible barriers that existed between police officers and the communities they protected, especially in affluent areas where assumptions about class and status could create unexpected blind spots. Mrs. Hayes waved from across the room, her silver hair catching the fluorescent lights as she made her way over with her characteristic warm smile. In the months since Tyler's party, she'd become something of a community organizer, using her extensive social network to promote better understanding between neighbors from different backgrounds. "Maria dear, how wonderful to see you in uniform tonight. You look so official and important." I smiled at her familiar enthusiasm. Mrs. Hayes had a gift for making everyone feel valued, something I'd come to appreciate even more after experiencing its opposite that summer evening. "How's the turnout looking?" "Excellent. We've got representation from all the major neighborhood associations, plus several new faces I haven't seen before." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Including the Hendersons from Maple Ridge. You know how exclusive they usually are." Maple Ridge was one of the most expensive developments in our jurisdiction, known for its gates and guards and general resistance to anything that might be perceived as government intrusion. Getting residents from there to attend a community meeting was indeed notable progress. "Any word from the Whitmans?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Hayes's expression shifted slightly. "Jennifer called to say they'd be here. Bradley's been different since that night, more thoughtful, maybe. Tyler says his father asks a lot more questions now before making assumptions about people." The change was encouraging, if not entirely surprising. Sometimes it took a public humbling to crack through years of unchallenged privilege. I'd seen it happen in criminal cases too, the moment when someone realized their worldview had been built on foundations that couldn't support scrutiny. Detective Lisa Thompson appeared beside me, her partner's badge gleaming under the community center lights. We'd been working together for 3 years, and she'd become both a trusted colleague and a genuine friend. Her presence tonight was part of the new initiative to make these meetings less formal, more conversational. "Ready for this?" Lisa asked, gesturing toward the growing crowd of residents. "Chief O'Connor says attendance is up 40% from last month. Word's getting around that these sessions actually accomplish things," I replied, thinking of the various neighborhood improvements that had emerged from previous meetings. Better lighting on walking paths, improved response protocols for domestic disturbances, and perhaps most importantly, regular opportunities for residents and officers to see each other as complete human beings, rather than abstract categories. The meeting officially began with Chief O'Connor's welcome remarks, but the real energy came when we opened the floor for questions and discussion. Tonight's focus was on crime prevention through community awareness, a topic that always generated passionate input from residents who cared deeply about their neighborhood's safety. About halfway through the session, Tyler Whitman raised his hand from the back of the room. He'd grown taller over the past 6 months, his voice deeper and more confident than I remembered from his birthday party. The gaming headset I'd given him had apparently launched a successful streaming career, something he'd mentioned in the occasional texts we'd exchanged about college applications and career planning. "Detective Santos," he said, standing up so his voice would carry across the room, "can you talk about undercover work? Like, how do you prepare to become someone completely different?" The question was clearly planned, part of an ongoing conversation we'd been having about law enforcement careers. But it also touched on something deeper, the art of transformation and identity that had been central to my professional development. "Great question, Tyler. Undercover work is really about understanding people deeply enough to mirror their expectations and behaviors. You have to study not just how different groups dress or talk, but how they think, what they value, what assumptions they make about the world." I could see several adults in the audience leaning forward, intrigued by this glimpse into police work they'd probably only seen in movies. But I was also aware that my answer was speaking to broader themes about social dynamics and human perception. "The hardest part," I continued, "isn't learning to act like someone else. It's maintaining your own sense of identity while adapting to situations where people might see you very differently than you see yourself." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "So it's kind of like what happened at my birthday party. When people saw you one way but you were actually someone completely different." The question sent a small ripple of recognition through the room. By now most regular attendees had heard some version of the story, either through Mrs. Hayes's enthusiastic retelling or through the general social network that connected Oakwood Heights residents. It had become something of a local legend, the tale of the detective who'd been mistaken for hired help at one of the community's most exclusive gatherings. "That's actually a perfect example," I said, grateful for Tyler's willingness to reference the incident publicly. That night, I experienced firsthand how quickly people can become invisible when they don't match certain expectations. It was uncomfortable, but it was also educational. Bradley Whitman, sitting near the front of the room, shifted in his chair but didn't look away. Over the past months, he'd made several attempts to acknowledge what had happened that evening, efforts that ranged from awkward apologies to genuine conversations about bias and assumption. The process had been uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it had also been necessary. An older gentleman I didn't recognize raised his hand. "Detective, can you help us understand how that kind of misunderstanding affects police work? I mean, if residents can't see officers clearly, how does that impact public safety?"
The question was more sophisticated than I'd expected, suggesting that the community was beginning to think critically about the intersection between social dynamics and law enforcement effectiveness. It's a significant issue, I replied. When people make assumptions about who belongs where, they miss important information. They might not report suspicious activity because they assume someone belongs in a situation when they don't. Or conversely, they might call police about perfectly legal behavior because someone doesn't match their expectations for a particular neighborhood. Lisa nodded beside me. We've seen both patterns in our work. The key is training residents to focus on behavior rather than appearance when assessing potential security concerns. The conversation that followed was more nuanced than I'd anticipated, touching on topics like implicit bias, community cohesion, and the delicate balance between vigilance and prejudice. Residents shared stories about their own assumptions and misperceptions, creating a space for honest discussion about how social dynamics affected neighborhood safety. Jennifer Whitman spoke up during this portion of the meeting, her voice careful but sincere. I think what happened at Tyler's party taught our whole family something important about the difference between being welcoming and actually seeing people. We thought we were being inclusive by having a diverse guest list, but we weren't really prepared to recognize diversity when it didn't announce itself obviously. The admission was brave, given the social circles she moved in, and the potential embarrassment of acknowledging such a public mistake. But it also demonstrated the kind of growth that could emerge from uncomfortable experiences when people were willing to examine themselves honestly. After the formal meeting concluded, several residents lingered to continue conversations in smaller groups. I found myself surrounded by people asking follow-up questions about police work, community safety, and the challenges of building trust across different demographics. Tyler approached with his parents, all three of them looking more relaxed than I'd seen them since the birthday party incident. The family dynamic had clearly evolved, with Tyler taking on more of a leadership role in conversations about social awareness and community responsibility. Detective Santos, Bradley said, extending his hand in greeting, "Thank you for your presentation tonight. Tyler's been telling us about your discussions regarding criminal justice careers, and I wanted to express our appreciation for the mentorship you've provided." The formal tone was vintage Bradley Whitman, but there was genuine warmth behind it that suggested real change rather than mere social performance. Tyler's a thoughtful young man with excellent instincts about people. He'll do well whatever career path he chooses. Actually, Tyler interjected with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting to share news. I got accepted to the criminal justice program at State University. Early admission. The announcement was met with congratulations from everyone within earshot, but I could see the particular pride in his parents' faces. 6 months ago, they might have been horrified by the idea of their son pursuing a career in public service, rather than following his father into finance or business. Now they seem genuinely excited about his chosen path. That's wonderful news, Tyler. The program at State has an excellent reputation, and they have strong connections with federal law enforcement agencies if you decide to pursue that direction. I was actually hoping you might write me a letter of recommendation for their honors track, he said, producing an official-looking form from his jacket pocket. I know it's a lot to ask, but you've been such an important mentor. The request caught me off guard, not because I was unwilling to help, but because it represented a level of trust and connection that felt almost surreal given how our relationship had begun. 6 months ago, I'd been parking cars at this young man's birthday party, invisible to his family and most of their guests. Now he was asking me to formally endorse his academic pursuits. I'd be honored to write that recommendation, I said, taking the form and noting the deadline. Your commitment to understanding different perspectives and your genuine interest in justice make you exactly the kind of person we need in law enforcement. As the evening wound down and residents began making their way to the parking lot, Mrs. Hayes appeared beside me with her purse and keys in hand. The community center was nearly empty now, just a few staff members cleaning up chairs and turning off lights. Maria dear, I hope you know how proud I am of what you've built here. These meetings have brought our community together in ways I never imagined possible. Her words carried extra weight because I knew she'd been the catalyst for much of what had followed that difficult evening. Without her invitation to Tyler's party, without her willingness to bridge social gaps between neighbors, none of the subsequent growth and connection would have happened. It's been a team effort, Mrs. Hayes. You've been the heart of this whole initiative, perhaps, but you've been the backbone. The way you handled that situation with grace and strength, the way you've turned it into something positive for everyone involved, that's real leadership. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Oakwood Heights, I reflected on how much had changed since that summer evening when I'd felt so invisible and out of place. The neighborhoods looked the same elegant houses and manicured lawns, the same obvious markers of wealth and status, but my relationship to this community had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer an outsider trying to find my place in someone else's world. I was a recognized leader, a bridge between different communities, someone whose voice carried weight in discussions about safety and inclusion and social responsibility. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been profound. The silver bracelet Tyler had given me caught the streetlight as I turned onto my street, the engraved word truth still as meaningful as it had been that first night. Truth about who I was, truth about what I deserved, truth about the assumptions people made, and the courage required to challenge them. My apartment building looked modest compared to the estates I'd just left, but it felt like home in a way it never had before. Mrs. Hayes's kitchen light was still on, probably preparing for tomorrow's book club meeting or organizing another community event. Detective Thompson's car was in its usual spot, evidence of a friendship that had grown stronger through our shared commitment to community policing. Inside my apartment, I spread Tyler's recommendation form on my kitchen table and began drafting the letter that would help launch his criminal justice career. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now in a position to open doors for the son of a man who had once tried to close them for me. But that wasn't really irony, I realized. That was growth, the kind of transformation that happened when people chose courage over comfort, honesty over easy assumptions. The letter I wrote that night spoke to Tyler's character, his intellectual curiosity, his commitment to understanding different perspectives, and his genuine desire to serve others. But it also reflected my own journey, the path from invisibility to recognition, from hurt to healing, from isolation to community leadership. 6 months later, when Tyler called to tell me he'd been accepted into the honors program, I thought about all the small moments that had led to this larger victory. A birthday party where I'd been mistaken for hired help, a police chief who'd refused to let prejudice go unchallenged, a teenager who'd been brave enough to apologize and curious enough to learn, a community that had chosen growth over comfort. None of it had been planned. All of it had mattered. The woman who had clutched a gift bag and felt invisible in a crowd of strangers was gone, replaced by someone who understood that visibility was something you claimed rather than something you waited for others to grant. That respect was earned through authenticity rather than performance. That the most powerful response to being unseen was to shine brighter, not to hide deeper in shadows. Tyler graduated summa cum laude 3.5 years later and was accepted into the FBI's training program at Quantico. He sent me a photo from his graduation ceremony, wearing his academic honors and standing between his parents, all three of them beaming with pride. But the photo I treasured most was from his first day at the academy, Tyler in his training uniform with a small silver shield pinned to his collar, a shield engraved with a single word that had become our shared motto: truth. Sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as the worst experiences. Sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones you meet in moments of crisis. And sometimes standing up for yourself creates ripples that extend far beyond your own life, touching the lives of people you never expected to influence. The evening that began with me feeling invisible had ended with an entire community learning to see more clearly. That was a legacy worth building, one small moment of courage at a time. The real transformation, I came to understand, wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Chief O'Connor had used the incident as a catalyst for department-wide training on community engagement and unconscious bias. What had started as my uncomfortable evening had become a case study in police academies across 3 states, teaching future officers about the importance of authentic community connection. Detective Thompson and I were invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to community policing. We developed a workshop called Beyond Assumptions that helped law enforcement professionals understand how their own biases could impact their effectiveness in diverse communities. The irony that my experience as a victim of assumption had made me an expert in recognizing and addressing it wasn't lost on either of us. But perhaps the most unexpected development came 2 years after that initial community meeting. The Oakwood Heights City Council approached me about running for a newly created position, Community Relations Liaison, a role that would bridge the gap between law enforcement and civilian oversight while maintaining independence from both. The job would mean leaving active detective work, something I'd never imagined wanting to do. But it also represented the chance to institutionalize the changes that had begun with Tyler's birthday party, to create lasting systems that would prevent other people from experiencing the invisibility I'd felt that night. Mrs. Hayes was my unofficial campaign manager, though there was no real campaign to speak of. The appointment was more of a community consensus, with support from neighborhood associations, the police department, and even some of the most exclusive residents who had initially been skeptical of increased oversight. Bradley Whitman, in a move that surprised everyone including himself, wrote a public letter endorsing my appointment. The letter, published in the Oakwood Heights Gazette, was a masterclass in acknowledging past mistakes while supporting future progress. Detective Santos represents the kind of professional integrity and community commitment our city needs, he wrote. Her ability to transform a personal slight into community-wide growth demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership we should support. I encourage all residents to embrace this opportunity for positive change. Jennifer later told me that Bradley had drafted and redrafted that letter 17 times, determined to get the tone exactly right. It was a small detail that spoke to his genuine commitment to making amends, not just through words, but through actions that carried real political and social weight. Tyler, now in his 2nd year at State University, came home for the weekend of my swearing-in ceremony. He'd grown into his role as a bridge between his privileged background and his chosen commitment to public service, often speaking to youth groups about the importance of questioning assumptions and examining privilege. "You know what's funny?" he said as we stood in the City Hall lobby before the ceremony. That night at my party, I thought the most interesting thing that would happen was getting a new gaming headset. I had no idea I was about to meet the person who would completely change how I see the world. The ceremony itself was surprisingly moving. Chief O'Connor administered the oath, her voice carrying the weight of everything we'd accomplished together over the past 2 years. The audience included faces I'd come to know well through community meetings, neighborhood events, and the slow, patient work of building trust across social and economic divides. But it was the faces I didn't recognize that meant the most to me. New residents who'd heard about Oakwood Heights' reputation for innovative community policing. Young professionals who'd moved to the area specifically because of our track record on inclusion and social justice. Families who saw our community as a place where their children could learn about diversity and civic engagement. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the community center where I'd held my first official meeting as a detective. The space had been transformed with flowers donated by local businesses and food prepared by a collective of neighborhood restaurants. It felt like a community celebration rather than a political event, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. During the reception, a young woman approached me with nervous energy and determined eyes. She introduced herself as Carmen Rodriguez, a recent graduate from the police academy who'd heard about our programs during her training. "Detective Santos, I wanted to thank you for the work you've done here. I'm starting my first assignment next month with the Metropolitan Police, and I've studied your community engagement model extensively. It's given me hope that police work can be about building relationships rather than just enforcing rules." The conversation that followed revealed that Carmen was the daughter of immigrants who'd worked multiple service jobs to put her through school. Her parents had cleaned office buildings and parked cars at events not unlike Tyler's birthday party, often experiencing the same invisibility I'd encountered that night. "The difference is," Carmen said, "they never had a Chief O'Connor or a supportive community to validate their worth when they were dismissed. They just went home tired and discouraged, wondering if their hard work mattered to anyone." Her words reminded me that my story, while personally significant, was far from unique. Countless people experience daily invisibility, casual dismissal, and automatic assumptions about their place in the world. The difference was that circumstances had aligned to give me a platform to address it publicly and systematically. "Carmen," I said, "I'd like you to consider something. Once you've gotten established in your new position, think about whether you might be interested in a fellowship program we're developing. We're looking for young officers who understand community dynamics from personal experience, people who can help us expand this model to other jurisdictions." Her face lit up with the kind of excitement that reminded me of Tyler's enthusiasm when he'd first learned about my detective work. There was something powerful about watching young people discover that their personal experiences, even difficult ones, could become tools for creating positive change. The fellowship program was still in development, but it represented the next phase of what had begun that summer evening. We were creating pathways for people who understood marginalization to become leaders and
Addressing it, building a network of law enforcement professionals who could recognize and respond to community dynamics that others might miss. 3 months into my new role, I received an unexpected invitation. The FBI's Community Outreach Division wanted me to consult on a national initiative addressing police-community relations in affluent suburban areas. Apparently, the Oakwood Heights model had gained attention from federal officials looking for scalable approaches to community policing. The invitation came with the opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C., and present our findings to a panel that included FBI directors, Justice Department officials, and community leaders from across the country. It was the kind of professional recognition I'd never imagined achieving, certainly not as a result of being mistaken for hired help at a teenager's birthday party. Tyler, now in his junior year and completing an internship with the State Attorney General's office, called me the night before my D.C. presentation. "Detective Santos? I know you're probably nervous about tomorrow, but I wanted to tell you something. Remember that night at my party when you said you'd learn something about your worth not depending on other people's recognition? I think about that all the time now. It's helped me understand that real leadership isn't about getting people to see you the way you want to be seen. It's about seeing yourself clearly enough that other people's assumptions can't diminish you." The wisdom in his words struck me as remarkable for someone who just turned 21. But then again, Tyler had been learning these lessons since he was 16, watching how gracefully someone could transform hurt into healing, invisibility into influence. The presentation in Washington went better than I dared hope. The panel was engaged, asking thoughtful questions about implementation strategies and measurement metrics. But more importantly, they were interested in the human elements of our approach, the way we built trust through vulnerability and created change through authentic relationship building. After the formal presentation, I was approached by Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist from Georgetown University who specialized in community development and social justice. She'd been taking notes throughout my talk, and her questions revealed a deep understanding of the dynamics we'd been addressing. "Miss Santos," she said, "I've been researching similar initiatives across the country, and what you've accomplished in Oakwood Heights is remarkable not just for its effectiveness, but for its sustainability. Most community policing programs struggle to maintain momentum after the initial enthusiasm fades. Your model seems to have built-in mechanisms for ongoing growth and adaptation." The conversation that followed led to an unexpected opportunity. Dr. Williams was developing a research project examining successful community policing innovations with funding from the National Science Foundation to study and document best practices. She wanted to use Oakwood Heights as a primary case study, following our progress over the next 5 years and analyzing the factors that contributed to our success. The research partnership would provide resources for expanding our programs while contributing to academic understanding of community development. It was exactly the kind of institutional support that could transform our local innovation into a replicable model for communities across the country. 6 months later, Dr. Williams and her research team published their preliminary findings in the Journal of Community Development. The paper, titled "From Invisibility to Leadership: Community Transformation Through Authentic Engagement," used my experience as a lens for examining broader patterns of social exclusion and inclusion. The academic recognition brought new attention to our work, but it also brought new responsibilities. I found myself fielding calls from community leaders, police chiefs, and city officials from across the country, all wanting to understand how they could implement similar programs in their own jurisdictions. Each conversation reinforced my understanding that the evening at Tyler's party had been a catalyst for something much larger than personal growth or local community improvement. It had become a symbol of the possibility for transformation when people chose courage over comfort, when communities committed to growth over maintaining convenient assumptions. Tyler graduated summa cum laude and was accepted into the FBI Academy, following through on the path we'd discussed during those early community meetings. His thesis project examined the intersection of economic privilege and unconscious bias in law enforcement, building on research that traced back to our conversations about that night at his birthday party. But the most meaningful recognition came 5 years after that initial incident, when the Oakwood Heights Community Center dedicated its main meeting room as the Maria Santos Community Engagement Center. The plaque by the door read, "In recognition of leadership that transforms individual courage into community growth." The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the programs and initiatives that had grown from that difficult evening. Mrs. Hayes, now in her 80s but still organizing neighborhood events, gave the keynote address about the importance of seeing potential in every person and every situation. Chief O'Connor, recently retired but still active in police reform initiatives, spoke about the ripple effects of individual courage. Detective Santos showed us that the most powerful response to being underestimated is not anger or withdrawal, but engagement. She turned a moment of personal hurt into a catalyst for community healing. But it was Tyler, now Special Agent Whitman with the FBI's Community Outreach Division, who provided the most moving tribute. He spoke about the teenager who'd learned to question assumptions, the young man who'd been inspired to pursue justice, and the agent who now carried those lessons into federal law enforcement. 5 years ago, I thought I knew how the world worked, he said to the gathered crowd. I thought respect was automatic, that belonging was simple, that good intentions were enough. Detective Santos taught me that real understanding requires courage, that authentic community demands uncomfortable conversations, and that the most important thing you can do when you witness injustice is refuse to look away. As I listened to him speak, I thought about the gift bag that had sat untouched in my car that night, the gaming headset I'd researched and saved for, chosen with care for a young man I'd never met. That small gesture of thoughtfulness had somehow grown into a relationship that changed both our lives, a mentorship that influenced his career, a connection that had helped transform our entire community. The woman who had walked up those stone steps feeling invisible and out of place was gone, replaced by someone who understood that visibility was not something you waited for others to grant. It was something you claimed through authenticity, defended through courage, and shared through service to others who needed to learn the same lesson. The evening that began with me parking cars had led to a career dedicated to ensuring that no one else would have to choose between invisibility and belonging. That was a legacy worth building, one authentic conversation at a time. 10 years after that transformative night, I stood in the auditorium of the National Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, preparing to deliver the opening keynote for the annual conference on community policing excellence. The audience of 800 included police chiefs, federal agents, community organizers, and academic researchers from across North America and beyond. The speech I was about to give had evolved from that simple story of being mistaken for hired help into something much larger, a comprehensive framework for understanding how individual experiences of marginalization could be transformed into systemic change. Universities were teaching courses based on the Santos model, and police academies had integrated our training modules into their standard curriculum. But as I looked out at the sea of faces, I found myself thinking not about policy frameworks or academic theories, but about the people whose lives had been quietly transformed along the way. Carmen Rodriguez had become the youngest detective in Metropolitan Police history and was now running community outreach programs in 3 major cities. Mrs. Hayes, though slowed by age, continued organizing neighborhood events that brought together residents from all economic backgrounds. Chief O'Connor, seated in the front row with the distinguished bearing of someone whose career had been defined by principled leadership, caught my eye and nodded encouragingly. Beside her sat Tyler, now 32 and serving as assistant director of the FBI's Community Relations Division. His presence represented the full circle of our unlikely partnership, the teenager who'd apologized for his parents' assumptions, now leading federal initiatives to address bias in law enforcement. The conference program listed my credentials: Community Relations Liaison for Oakwood Heights, Consultant to the Department of Justice, Distinguished Fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Social Justice, author of Beyond Assumptions, Building Authentic Police Community Partnerships. But none of those titles captured the real story, which began with a woman clutching a gift bag and wondering if she belonged anywhere. 10 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. I learned that the most dangerous assumption we make is about our own worthiness. Not the assumptions others make about us, though those certainly matter, but the assumptions we make about whether we deserve to be seen, heard, and valued exactly as we are. The opening line was one I'd refined through hundreds of presentations, but it still carried the weight of personal truth. In the audience, I could see people leaning forward, recognizing something familiar in the premise, even if they didn't know the specific story that would follow. I told them about the valet mix-up, about Frank's kindness and Chief O'Connor's intervention, about Tyler's genuine apology and the community meetings that followed. But I also told them about the deeper lessons that had emerged over the years of implementing change, how individual courage could create institutional transformation, how authentic vulnerability could build stronger communities than performative strength, how the people most equipped to solve problems were often those who had experienced them personally. During the question and answer session, a young police officer from Seattle raised her hand. "Miss Santos, I appreciate your story, but I'm struggling with something. How do we balance the need to address bias and assumptions with the practical realities of law enforcement? Sometimes we do need to make quick judgments about people and situations." It was a thoughtful question that got to the heart of why our work mattered beyond feel-good narratives about personal growth. That's exactly the right question, I replied. The goal isn't to eliminate all judgment or assessment. It's to base those judgments on behavior and evidence rather than appearance and assumption. When I was parking cars that night, no one asked what I was doing there or whether I had permission to handle their vehicles. They assumed, based on how I looked, rather than observing what I was actually doing. The conversation that followed explored the practical applications of these principles, how to train officers to distinguish between necessary assessment and unconscious bias, how to build community trust without compromising officer safety, how to create accountability systems that supported both effective policing and civil rights protection. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Kim, a professor from the University of California who'd been studying the long-term impacts of community policing reforms. Her research team had been following the Oakwood Heights model for 7 years, tracking everything from crime statistics to resident satisfaction surveys to officer retention rates. Ms. Santos, I wanted to share some findings from our longitudinal study. The communities that have implemented your approach show statistically significant improvements, not just in police-community relations, but in overall social cohesion, economic development, and civic engagement. It appears that addressing assumptions and bias creates positive effects that extend far beyond law enforcement. The research validated what we'd observed anecdotally over the years. When communities learned to see people more clearly, when they created systems for authentic engagement across social and economic divides, the benefits rippled outward in unexpected ways. Property values in diverse neighborhoods stabilized as social tensions decreased. Local businesses thrived as residents from different backgrounds began shopping and socializing together. Schools reported improved academic outcomes as families became more engaged in community life. That evening, the conference organizers hosted a dinner for keynote speakers and distinguished guests. I found myself seated at a table with law enforcement leaders from around the world, each sharing stories about their own efforts to build stronger police-community relationships in their jurisdictions. Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison from London's Metropolitan Police described her department's adoption of our training protocols after several high-profile incidents involving assumptions about race and class. Commissioner Jacques Dubois from Montreal discussed how our community meeting model had helped bridge linguistic and cultural divides in his city's diverse neighborhoods. But the most moving story came from Captain Maria Fernandez of the Los Angeles Police Department, who'd implemented our approach in East LA after years of tension between officers and immigrant communities. The breakthrough came, she said, when we stopped trying to prove we weren't biased and started acknowledging that everyone carries assumptions. Once we created space for honest conversation about those assumptions, we could begin the real work of building trust. Later that evening, Tyler and I walked through the hotel gardens, catching up on developments in our respective careers and reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. He'd recently been promoted to assistant director, the youngest person ever to hold that position in the FBI's Community Relations Division. You know what's strange? Tyler said as we paused by a fountain surrounded by blooming magnolias. Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if Dad hadn't made that assumption about you that night. If he'd introduced himself properly, if you'd enjoyed the party as a regular guest, if none of this had ever happened. The hypothetical scenario was one I'd considered many times over the years. Would I have remained a detective, competent but unremarkable, working cases and going home without ever discovering my capacity for community leadership? Would Tyler have pursued a traditional business career, never questioning the assumptions he'd inherited about how the world worked? I think, I said carefully, that we both would have lived smaller lives, not unhappy necessarily, but smaller, less connected to the possibility for real change. Tyler nodded thoughtfully.
I was reading your book again last week, preparing for my own presentation about federal community outreach initiatives. There's something you wrote about how the worst experiences can become the best preparation for helping other people. I keep coming back to that idea. The book he referenced, Beyond Assumptions, had been published 3 years earlier and had become something of a standard text in police academies and social work programs. But Tyler's insight touched on something deeper than professional development or career preparation. It spoke to the alchemy of transformation, the mysterious process by which personal pain could be converted into public service. The key, I said, is that experience alone isn't enough. You can go through difficult things and come out bitter or withdrawn, or convinced that the world is unfair and there's nothing you can do about it. The transformation happens when you choose to use those experiences as fuel for creating change, rather than evidence that change is impossible. Our conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young man I didn't recognize, probably in his early 20s, with the nervous energy of someone working up courage to introduce himself. He'd clearly been waiting for an opportunity to approach us without interrupting. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "Are you Maria Santos, the community relations expert?" When I nodded, his face broke into a broad smile. "My name is David Okafor. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown, working on my thesis about police community relations in immigrant communities. Your work has been incredibly influential in my research." The conversation that followed revealed that David was the son of Nigerian immigrants who'd worked as janitors and housekeepers while putting him through school. His parents had experienced their own versions of invisibility and assumption, their professional qualifications from their home country unrecognized, their intelligence underestimated based on their accented English and service jobs. What you've written about transforming personal experience into systemic change has given me a framework for understanding how to use my family's story as a foundation for policy research, rather than just personal narrative. David said, "I'm hoping to work in federal community development after I finish my PhD." Tyler and I exchanged glances, recognizing in David the same combination of personal experience and professional ambition that had driven our own career paths. Here was another young person preparing to transform hurt into healing, marginalization into leadership. "David," Tyler said, "have you heard about the Community Leadership Fellowship program we're launching next year? We're looking for doctoral candidates who combine academic research with lived experience of community dynamics." The program Tyler referenced was our latest initiative, designed to create pathways for people like David to enter federal service while continuing their research and community engagement. It represented the institutionalization of lessons we'd learned over the past decade, that the people most equipped to solve complex social problems were often those who had experienced them personally. As we talked with David about his research and career plans, I found myself reflecting on the expanding network of relationships and opportunities that had grown from that single evening of discomfort and recognition. Each person whose life had been touched by our work was now touching other lives, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond anything I could have imagined while sitting in my car outside the Whitman estate. The next morning, I delivered a closing presentation about the future of community policing, focusing on emerging technologies and changing demographics that would shape law enforcement in the coming decade. But the real message was about the timeless importance of seeing people clearly, of questioning assumptions, of creating space for authentic dialogue across difference. After the conference concluded, I flew back to Washington, D.C. for a meeting at the Department of Justice. The Attorney General had requested a briefing on our research findings and their potential applications for federal policy. It was the kind of high-level recognition that would have seemed impossible when I was Detective Santos, writing reports and working cases in suburban Oakwood Heights. The DOJ meeting led to an invitation to serve on a presidential commission examining police reform and community relations. The commission would spend 2 years studying best practices, conducting public hearings, and developing recommendations for federal legislation. It was an opportunity to influence policy at the highest levels of government, to ensure that the lessons learned in one suburban community could benefit people across the entire country. But even as my professional responsibilities expanded to national and international levels, the work that felt most meaningful continued to happen in smaller, more personal settings. Monthly community meetings in Oakwood Heights, where residents still gathered to discuss safety concerns and celebrate neighborhood improvements. Mentorship conversations with young officers learning to navigate complex community dynamics. Speaking engagements at high schools, where students were beginning to think about careers in public service. Mrs. Hayes, now 87, and moving more slowly but still sharp as ever, continued to attend our community meetings. She'd become something of a local legend, the elderly woman who'd accidentally catalyzed a transformation by inviting the right person to the wrong party at exactly the right moment. "You know, dear," she said to me after one particularly successful meeting where residents had organized a neighborhood festival celebrating the community's diversity, "I sometimes think about that evening when I invited you to Tyler's party. I was just trying to be neighborly to help you meet some people. I had no idea we were changing history." Her words reminded me that most transformation begins with small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness or courage. Mrs. Hayes had simply seen a hard-working neighbor who deserved to be included in community life. Tyler had been brave enough to apologize for his parents' behavior and curious enough to learn from someone different from himself. Chief O'Connor had refused to let prejudice and assumption go unchallenged. Each person had made choices that seemed small in the moment but had accumulated into something much larger. Together, we'd proven that change was possible, that communities could learn and grow, that individual courage could indeed become collective transformation. 15 years after that first community meeting, I received a call from Tyler with news that would have seemed unimaginable when he was a 16-year-old, celebrating his birthday with 300 guests. He'd been nominated to serve as the FBI's deputy director, making him the youngest person ever considered for such a high-ranking position. "The confirmation hearings are going to be intense," he said, his voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. "They'll examine every aspect of my background, every decision I've made, every relationship that shaped my career." I knew he was thinking about that birthday party, about the public nature of his family's mistakes, and the very visible process of learning and growth that had followed. In today's political climate, such stories could be weaponized by opponents or distorted by media coverage that prioritized conflict over context. "Tyler," I said, "that story isn't a liability, it's your qualification. It shows that you understand how assumptions and bias affect communities, that you've been committed to addressing these issues for your entire adult life, and that you have the courage to acknowledge mistakes and work for change." The confirmation hearings, when they finally took place, were indeed thorough. Senators questioned Tyler about everything from his policy positions, to his law enforcement philosophy, to his personal background. When Senator Patricia Hamilton from Texas asked about his unusual entry into public service, Tyler's answer was both honest and compelling. "Senator, my understanding of community policing was shaped by witnessing firsthand how assumptions and unconscious bias can affect real people's lives. When I was 16 years old, my family made serious mistakes in how we treated a police detective who came to my birthday party as a guest. Instead of being defensive about those mistakes, I chose to learn from them. Detective Santos became a mentor who helped me understand that effective law enforcement requires authentic relationship building with all community members, regardless of their background or economic status." The story that could have been a source of embarrassment became instead a demonstration of character, growth, and commitment to justice. Tyler was confirmed by a wide margin, with bipartisan support from senators who appreciated his combination of professional competence and personal integrity. At his swearing-in ceremony, I sat in the audience beside Mrs. Hayes, Chief O'Connor, and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that long-ago evening. The young man taking the oath to serve his country with honor and distinction was the same person who'd offered a genuine apology to someone his family had wronged, who'd chosen curiosity over defensiveness, growth over comfort. In his acceptance speech, Tyler spoke about the importance of law enforcement that served all communities with equal respect and protection. But the line that resonated most deeply with those of us who knew his story came near the end. True justice requires the courage to examine our own assumptions and the wisdom to learn from people whose experiences differ from our own. After the ceremony, during the reception at FBI headquarters, Tyler found me in the crowd and pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know," he said, "that every major decision in my career has been guided by lessons I learned from you that night, and in all the conversations that followed. The question I ask myself isn't whether I'm making the safe choice or the popular choice. It's whether I'm making the choice that honors the dignity of every person who might be affected." The standard he described was one I'd learned to apply in my own work, measuring success not by recognition or advancement, but by the impact on people who had previously been invisible or marginalized. It was a legacy I was proud to share with someone who had started as an awkward teenager, apologizing for his parents, and grown into one of the most influential law enforcement leaders in the country. As I reflected on the journey from that summer evening to this moment of national recognition, I realized that the real transformation hadn't been about overcoming a single incident of prejudice or assumption. It had been about discovering that individual experiences of marginalization, when met with courage and community support, could become powerful tools for creating systemic change. The woman who had once felt invisible while parking cars at a birthday party had helped build a network of relationships, policies, and institutions dedicated to ensuring that no one else would have to choose between belonging and authenticity. That was a legacy worth celebrating, not just for personal satisfaction, but for the countless lives it would continue to touch in ways both seen and unseen. The story that began with assumptions and ended with transformation had become something larger than any individual experience. It had become proof that change was possible, that communities could learn and grow, and that the most powerful response to being underestimated was not anger or withdrawal, but engagement that creates space for everyone to be seen clearly. 20 years later, that lesson continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing communities in ways that would have seemed impossible when I first clutched that gift bag and wondered if I belonged anywhere at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.